Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. We've got about 30 folks, it looks like, on the line, and we should have a number of other folks joining us. So thanks again to everyone for coming today. This is Greg Johnson of the Water Supply Planning section of the Water Conservation Board. We're really thankful that everyone was able to join in. We wanted to give you a better picture of where we're headed, primarily with the Basin Implementation Plan process, but all of this ties together. It's all part of the water plan, and of course part of the statewide water supply initiative update that we've been working pretty hard on. So before we get going too much, I wanted to just introduce in the room today. I've got Megan Holcomb, Russ Sands, Craig Gabu, and Vivian, who is working with us within the last few months, I think, Vivian, at the front desk at CWCB, and doing an awesome job in helping us to really compile some of the comments that you all have. So the way that we wanted to run this, we're actually using the Zoom account from the Water Congress. So a big thank you to Doug for helping out with that. Moving forward, I think we're going to have a GoToMeeting account set up. So look for a slight change in the technology. But the way we wanted to run things is to have folks feel free to enter any questions that you might have into the chat box. And we will be logging those and making sure that we see the feedback and the questions that are coming in, and then to try to respond to those during the session if possible, and then at the end. And we'll certainly open things up at the end too. I think the default is when you call in, you should be muted. I think that is something you can control, so you could unmute yourself and speak up at any time. But if possible, you wanted to kind of wait for that for the end, if you could hold your questions to the end verbally, but please feel free to use that chat box if you've got burning questions that come up during the presentation. So that's how we're going to run things today. Just, again, I wanted to really thank everyone. I know everybody is really busy, and it's especially this time of year right before the holidays. But we really wanted to open up this call to everyone on the roundtable, any interested parties, to really do our best to show you where things are headed with this process. We have 90 minutes scheduled for this and other implementation working group calls monthly moving forward from here. That said, we're really not planning to take the full 90 minutes, especially today, likely not with some of the other sessions as well. But we wanted to block out that time so that we have it if we need to. So just getting to the agenda of the call, we've got three main things today. I'm going to focus on the first there, so on the purpose of kind of why we're doing this and where it came from. Then I'll kick it over to, sorry, my apologies, we're having some issues with the auto advance technology here. We'll get it sorted out. I'm going to hand it over to Megan to go through the logistics a little bit more, and then to Russ to finish things up and wrap it up with the goals of what we're really seeking to get out of this process. So I guess I really wanted to start with kind of overview of who's involved and how did we get here. So where did this come from? Hopefully this didn't seem like it was too terribly out of the blue. We've been having conversations for a long time about what it might look like to move the basin plans forward. And I think everyone understands who's on the call probably that most of what we've done post water plan, when we published the Colorado Water Plan in 2015, was to really pivot to a focus on implementation. So we've got a plan that, of course, wrapped up all the work on the Basin implementation plans. And the next step, of course, was, okay, let's get to work. Let's find the funding for the appropriate projects and get things moving along. But all the time thinking that we really need to keep the ball moving on planning and updating and supporting the whole effort behind all of this. So we can't just write a plan, put it on the shelf, and then just focus on approving grant applications and moving things forward that way. What we really need is to have a solid list of what projects are out there, be continually updating that list, and like any given planning process with any water provider or irrigation district or other entity, really be thinking about the future, looking at what that planning cycle is. So for example, there are master plans that a utility will be updating on a 5 or 10 year cycle. So we've been really trying to figure out what that appropriate cycle is, what that appropriate process is. And this whole process, more than anything, by this process I mean this task group working with you all, is to really help get the feedback on what works, on what is the most appropriate way to do all of this. So where this came from really was, again, we had a lot of informal conversations, excuse me, with Roundtable members, with Roundtable chairs. But then at the Summer Water Congress last year in August, we kicked off a survey, a fairly simple survey. And then we continued to announce that we had a couple email blasts and discussed this at Roundtable meetings, but to really try to get your initial feedback on, okay, where are you with updating the basin plans? Is this something there's an appetite for? If we were to update the basin plans, what would that look like? And then we even had a question about volunteers. Would there be any volunteers who might be interested in helping us inform this process? And so a lot of you all on the call are folks that had responded to that. So a big thank you and my apologies. I know everybody's very busy and gets roped into one more thing, but we really, really do appreciate everyone's involvement in this process. So that's how we had initially kicked it off. We had conversations, as I said, with Roundtable chairs. We had an all Roundtable chair call in September, October. We have visited every single Roundtable with an update on the current status of the statewide water supply initiative update. I believe we're still circling back with the Yampa in January. We had some scheduling issues there, but we'll be up there in January. So all of this conversation has culminated to a large extent in this particular process to really help move this forward. So I also wanted to note that today, we do have folks on the call that will likely not be a part of the implementation working group moving forward. We really wanted to open up this kickoff call to anyone and everyone, with the Roundtable process who was just interested in where things were headed. And then moving forward to really try to focus things in on a handful of representatives from each of the Roundtables. So that's where we had worked with you all, with the volunteers and with the chairs, to select 3 members from each Roundtable. What was the plan? I think in some cases we may have 2, in some cases maybe 4, but we really wanted about 3 members from each Roundtable, and that includes, in most cases, IBCC representatives as well. And the thought there is that we certainly understand, again, that everyone is busy and that we may not get, all 3 of you from each of the Basin Roundtables, but at least if we have some coverage, and then I'll let Megan speak more to the logistics, to the logistics of our feedback loop and kind of how we're going to operate moving forward. Oh, no, that's good. Sorry. A lot of this really came from Chapter 11 of the water plan. So if you remember the water plan, Chapter 10 was the critical action. So that's where we really got to, the hard details of what our process is moving forward. Then Chapter 11 was really simple. It was 1 page, included a table, and it had, the cycle at the time when we published that again in 2015 of how we envisioned moving this forward. So basically updating everything every 6 years, every 2 years doing one of the 3 things, whether that's water plan, the basin plans, or the statewide water supply initiative. So we have been doing our best to really stay true to this process. But like I said right off the bat, the whole point of why we're doing this task group with you all is feedback. So it's trying to not figure out this whole planning cycle in a vacuum. And of course, not just the timing of it, but the details, the hard questions about what each of these things entail. But to start from day one, to get input from each of the basins and from Roundtable members on what this should look like. So I think the important thing to point out what this is not. It's not a thorough format at this time for digging into the statewide water supply initiative data. That's something that we actually have a separate venue for that we're trying to ease into, actually on a similar schedule. So in the months ahead, I believe January, February, through the release in July of 2019, we will be having a number of technical webinars. So of course, everyone is welcome to attend those. I believe we have those scheduled for the 4th Tuesday. And that will be a separate process to start to dive into where things are headed with the statewide water supply initiative update. And then certainly when we release that, we'll be doing a whole lot more work with getting the information out and what exactly the data is showing. So that's what this process is not. This is really more of a higher level engagement on where the roundtables are, with updating project information with all these different pieces that were in the basin plans, and then being able for us to really tie that ultimately back to an update of the water plan that's forthcoming. So that we have the schedule where we're focusing on, every 2 years. Not sure that's the right schedule necessarily, but we are open to kind of what this looks like and how to move things forward. So a quick reminder that this is very different. SWASI this time around, the Statewide Water Supply Initiative is very different from anything that we've done in the past. In a lot of ways, we've gone out and we've been saying that we want to control expectations of what this is and what it isn't, because it is so different, being a hydrologic modeling exercise. So going through using the DSS models everywhere that we can, where we have them, using the DSS information where we don't have models, using HydroBase. Where in the Arkansas, for example, where things are being developed, we have a lot of information, and really looking at water supply gaps, water demands in a whole new way, in a much more detailed way. And that's something that is going to yield a very different way of looking at things and a different way of focusing in on what those gaps are and kind of how those might inform our project planning moving forward. So the technical webinars I've already mentioned. We do have those on the fourth Tuesday. These will all be posted on the website with signups. I believe we have. I think the signups are all live via Eventbrite. If you ever used an Eventbrite signup, so those are live. We will have question and feedback forms for each of those, which are not quite live yet, but we will have those up soon. Those are organized by topic. And I think we really want to encourage you to submit any questions or any feedback that you have in advance of those meetings, using the simple feedback forms that we have. It's just a Google form. I think it's 4 or 5 things about whether it's a solid feedback that you have or questions. But that will really help us anticipate what some of your questions or your interests are for each of these topics. So please feel free to submit that information. And as far as the Statewide Water Supply Initiative goals, I think this feeds really well into what we're doing here. So it's 2 main things that we've been saying. It's a consistent statewide framework for examining water supply and demand scenarios throughout the state. So of course, we're doing a scenario planning process for the first time. And then the second part there is really, much more the focus of what we're headed on to get into with this process. It's tools and data for the roundtables to use to update the basin plans. So the whole point of the Statewide Water Supply Initiative is to really provide the technical foundation for the Basin Roundtables to use to then be constructive in planning, what needs to be done at the local level. And then that, of course, gets rolled up directly into the statewide water plan that we will be updating subsequently. So this all ties together, and we're excited. I know it's been a long time coming. There's a whole lot of technical work that's been going into the Statewide Water Supply Initiative update, but we're really excited to anticipate the release of that and start this conversation with you to make sure things are headed in the right direction. So we wanted to go through some of the feedback that we heard from the Basin Roundtables. In a lot of these conversations that I've mentioned, a lot of folks have said that they want to spend the limited amount of money that you have with the Water Supply Reserve Fund, with the grant money, on projects. That in a lot of ways it doesn't make sense to take this very important source of grant funding and use it to further planning when you don't have enough money to begin with to really implement the projects, which has been the focus. So we definitely heard that loud and clear. We heard that it took a lot of time and was really a challenge to work on the basin plans the first time around. And we're certainly sympathetic to that. And I think that's a large part of the conversation that we have now is what is important to update, what's not. We are not saying that we just need to go in and update this tomorrow and update everything. We want to be very thoughtful about how this is done. And of course, there's a strong desire to utilize and integrate the findings from the Statewide Water Supply Initiative. So as part of the polling that I mentioned earlier that we did, definitely the majority saw a need for improved metrics. This is something that we've been moving towards, I think, as a state globally. This is, and probably not even as a state, this is certainly, I think the world is moving in this direction as we get better and better data, a lot of discussion about big data. It's not always easy to measure everything, but we've been getting better and better at that. And where we have data, we need to do a better job collecting that. So we saw a lot of support for that. We saw, a strong 2/3 majority in favoring this kind of a working group to really dig into what the updates will look like. And then finally, we saw a very, very strong support for funding to help with this process. So to provide funding for updating the basin plans and some of that project data that we have. So to that end, we have been working, and this is very, very much preliminary. So we have to be really careful kind of how we discuss this and kind of what's involved at this point. But we have included an ask, and it's just an ask at this point, but it has been approved by our board in what's called our projects bill. So the CWCB projects bill every year goes to the legislature, through the work of the committees. Ultimately, of course, gets introduced. There's a lot of discussion. And then typically after some amount of editing and whatnot, gets passed fairly late in the session. So this is extremely early in this process, and we certainly don't want to be presumptuous on where this may go, but we have included an ask in the projects bill for $5.5 million to help with this whole process. And this is not just with updates to the basin plans. This actually includes up through the next iteration of actually updating the water plan, and then a number of different efforts to help with innovation and outreach, some fairly robust improvements to the House Bill 1051 database, which is the water use conservation data reporting, which was required for covered entities, which are water providers that deliver over 2,000 acre-feet of treated water a year through legislation in 2010, really specifically for this purpose of helping to inform our statewide water planning process with better data. As you'll see, as we get into more of the data release for the statewide water supply initiative update, it has been really, really helpful. So there's a number of tweaks to that we can include. The IPP database, so Identified Projects and Process database, is something that we've been working on for a number of years, but we still have a ways to go to get a robust, online, simplified, user-friendly database that you all can use. So we're all really singing the same tune and have our data in one place. And this is something that's extremely important, especially in terms of the funding, this funding included, but especially all funding moving forward. There's been a lot of conversations about potential future funding sources, so that we have better data. We really know exactly, not exactly, I shouldn't say, because of course you never know, projected needs and projects, exactly, but as good of data as you can have moving forward to help inform the conversations with the legislature, with others that need that information moving forward to really justify the need for that funding. So we will keep you posted as that conversation continues, but we wanted to let you know that we do have this ask out there that we've included. Again, the point being that we will not be asking you to include, separate asks from your water supply reserve grant funds. This is something that we are looking to really help shepherd along a lot more constructively than we did last time around. I think there was a lot of work that went into kind of how this was going to roll out the last time, but we really weren't prepared with funding at the time. And so now we're able to hopefully get out a little bit ahead of this, come to the table with money to help with this process, and then through the conversation with this working group, really help inform how all of this plays out. So there's still a lot of questions, with the specifics of that funding. Of course, we're far from having anything approved. We penciled in some of the rationale for, some of the tasks and subtasks and how some of this may play out. We do not envision necessarily that this will be, a big lump sum going straight to each of the roundtables and then, a hiring process of doing an RFP and hiring consultants and contractors directly through the roundtables. We had a lot of issues with our contracting details through the contracting rules and regulations that we have last time around. So another big piece of this is working with our contracting folks and seeing what makes the most sense. And then, again, back to the concept of having a lot more support, being able to really provide some of the firepower for you. We envision having some contractor support that, for example, could help with further hydrologic modeling if that was of interest, could help with some of the project information and getting things organized in one place. So that's, a lot of the details that we have to figure out, but we've been trying to put pen to paper behind the scenes on a lot of that. So just roughly, that $5.5 million ask is about twice the cost of the statewide water supply initiative to update the basin plans and the water plan. Just putting things in perspective, that we're updating two of the major pillars with hopefully a responsible amount of funding. This is certainly informed by known costs that we've had in the past. So again, we've been working on crunching the numbers behind the scenes and providing whatever support we need when we have those questions with the legislature, and then really filling that critical data and reporting needs, not only for House Bill 1051, but also and especially, I would say, on the project side. And just as a side note, we're working on streamlining our website at the same time, and eventually having a much more streamlined grant application portal across all the different grant programs that we have. So there's a lot that's been going on behind the scenes to keep us busy, but we're really hoping to make things a lot more user-friendly moving forward for you all. So finally, that was most of the why we're doing this, kind of where this is coming from. Now we're going to get into the what. So what this process will include, and this is where I'm going to hand things over to Russ and Megan to get into. But really three main things that we wanted to have this group talk about in the next 6 months. So number one, this branding piece. A lot of this gets to what the three main elements are, so being water plan, basin plan, and a statewide water supply initiative, and how they really tie together, how they are part of one cohesive whole. So looking at the communications, looking at tools and messaging, and what all of this means, and trying to get beyond some of the acronyms that we've had, some of the kind of wonky conversations, to be a little bit more accessible in the vein of the water plan. Number two, they're really focusing on the BIP updates. So on the project database inputs. So again, honing a database so that we have one centralized IPP database that has up-to-date information that is useful for folks when they need it, and then critical updates to the basin plans, and really trying to streamline that contracting, as I briefly mentioned. But that's been something that I think has slowed down a number of projects in the past, and we have a number of restrictions in the ways that we can do things at the state level. So really starting today, actually we started a couple months ago, talking with folks not only on our floor here at Department of Natural Resources, but also on the fourth floor, which is the DNR accounting, on how to really get this moving without any hiccups, to provide you the support that you need, and then still have the flexibility you need to bring in folks at the local level. So we don't envision controlling all of this from Denver by any means. We have this funding that we're going after, but we want to provide the ample support for you, and then have that built-in flexibility where I know folks have worked with local contractors in many cases to still have that be a very good option for you to use moving forward as well. And then finally, the guidance coming out of the update to the statewide water supply initiative. So what are the recommendations coming out of that study, and really how do you use that? How do you integrate it with the basin plans? What are the appropriate insights to each of the basins? And so there's going to be a whole lot in there. It's not going to be all things to all people, but there's going to be a lot of information that we really hope will help inform your conversation moving forward. So those are the three main things we're really hoping to focus on with this group in the next 6 months.
Very good. Yeah, we had a question come in. Do you want to take a break now, or do you want to read it? Or?
Sure.
So just, I think you might have hit on it, but there was a question that, given basin feedback, is now the time for CWCB to ask for this $5.5 million request? Could that wait for at least several more years and not just do endless planning, but rather funnel those monies into project grants?
I would say that's a great question. That's certainly something we've heard from some of the roundtables. So hopefully folks heard the question that Russ just read. So it's, why would we spend the money basically on planning right now instead of just funneling all that straight towards projects? And I would say that it's an all the above approach. That we understand, and absolutely that the bulk of the funding should be spent on projects, and I would say that it is spent on projects. We have, between the different grant programs, tens of millions of dollars going to fund projects. The governor, in his request, of course, we'll see where things happen. This is the lame duck session right now, but the governor in his budget request for next year included $30 million of additional funding, actually from the general fund, to fund water supply projects. And when we've had this conversation with our board, the response very loud and clear has been, by all means, we need to keep planning. So, and I would add too that that's the whole point of this conversation, is not to say we have to plan, we're going to tell you to plan, and here's how to do it. It's going to say, we know planning needs to continue. We're not sure what that looks like. We'd like to get your feedback on how to do that. What's the most important part of that? But one thing, I think it was Russ George who said, you know, that the day you stop planning is the day that, you know, your foresight and your good plans kind of die. To really have an effective plan, you need to always be kind of taking your temperature, you know, seeing where things are at. That's really the whole point of the statewide water supply initiative this time around, is, you know, get better information on where those gaps are, what the hydrology looks like, you know, where things are wetter or drier, and maybe in a lot of cases drier, and then using that information to be able to be more strategic about projects. So that's very, very valid concern, and we certainly hear you. But I think, again, it's an all the above approach, that we do need to keep the planning moving forward. And I think I would mention too that, you know, we really don't know that cycle. So one thing that we're not necessarily married to is updating each of these things every 6 years, so something every 2 years. I'm frankly not sure that that's realistic or helpful. So we're really trying to figure out what that planning cycle is and how all of these things feed into each other. So the last thing we want to do is you know, just plan for the sake of planning. We totally get that.
I would maybe add, I feel like this is Russ. I think that we have taken, because of this night and day approach with SWASI, we're really, you know, now that we're kind of laying it out and thinking about how that integrates, hoping that we lay out a methodology for making these updates more streamlined moving forward. A big piece of that, and a large chunk of some of this budgeting, is going for a IPP database rather than kind of managing all the IPPs across spreadsheets and having some gaps in that data we get. So to that end, the stronger that we make that and the more user-friendly and the easier it is to kind of get information on an update, the better we can justify funding that goes back to the roundtables. So I think that there are, whether it's the IPP database gaps or certainly in House Bill 1051, just even going through the SWASI analysis, we realized that there were some pretty critical gaps and errors just in how the data comes in that we probably need to fix, and it'll take a little bit of money and time to kind of get those right, and working with stakeholders on how we can maybe create better flags so that you can't enter erroneous information. There's some things like a negative water use number that I would say is probably incorrect, that gets entered sometimes, that it's possible depending on how meter reads come in, but not likely. So having some better questions on the front end of what we want to get out on the outputs, and then really tying those back to the metrics in the water plan, and all that's going to take some careful consideration.
Yeah, you might be able to answer that one after.
Sure. Yeah, so the question that came in, and we'll see if the time, what aspects of the BRP are thought to need update? BRTs are updating IPP lists without need of major BIP review. I think we'll touch on that in a second, so maybe we'll just flag that, and then if we haven't answered it, let us know here in a little bit.
Okay. And I just wanted to add one more clarification on the $30 million that was in the proposed budget for the governor. That $30 million is not all specifically for water plan grants, but some of it was actually potentially earmarked for demand management type activities. I know there's been a whole lot of conversation around that. So, you know, also funding, you know, water projects to some extent, but a different bucket. So we're still trying to figure out the details of that and where that's headed, of course, with the legislature. Just wanted to make sure it was perfectly clear.
Cool. Okay, this is Megan, and I'm going to go over some of the details of the implementation working group and how that's going to be run in the coming months. So these calls are going to be monthly we've blocked out an hour and a half from January to July. We're going to reserve that July meeting just if needed. So you should have received, if you have volunteered for this working group, a calendar invite this morning for each of those meetings. The calls are going to be on the fourth Tuesday of each month, which is the same day as those SWASI tech webinars. So the working group calls will be just before the tech webinars that Greg had mentioned before. This is really just a screen grab of all of those meetings. You can see that in January, it's actually there is not a Swazi Tech webinar. Those start in February. But the January working group meeting is going to be during the PEPO Water Congress meeting. It'll be the second half of that meeting. So if you are at Water Congress, you're more than welcome to attend in person for the working group. There will be a call-in, and it's not expected you have to be there in person. So all the other calls, however, are going to be just through GoToMeeting. And in those calendar invites you should have received are already set up the call-in numbers and information for those dates. So due to the number of people on these calls, which Greg had mentioned includes 2 to 3 roundtable members from each roundtable, as well as some IBCC representatives, we're going to limit the amount of open discussion time just for the sake of getting through an agenda. You're going to be muted upon the entry of the webinar, but we'll have an active live chat feed, quite like today, where we can funnel in common questions, and Vivian has so kindly volunteered to assist with the working group calls and will help us review those as they come in. We'll do our best to address in the given time the questions that come in, but if we need to follow up afterwards after the call, we will make that happen as well. So in trying to make these efficient meetings where we can make some decisions and get your input, we are going to prepare pre-meeting documentation that you'll review in advance of the working group meeting, and we may highlight specific decisions or input points that will come up on each call. Generally, staff will open with a presentation and we'll review those questions as we go, but the working group members will be asked to indicate if they generally feel we're headed in the right direction with the goal of majority support, which will be conducted through live polling. So some of you may have seen us use this live polling in the past year. This will be incorporated into some, perhaps not every meeting depending on the content we're covering, but as an easy way to gather everyone's feedback without the popcorn, speaking up and calling people out in turn when we have about 30 people on each call. So that said, some of the meetings may also include some post-work assignments, such as reviewing modified drafts of Swazi or BIP recommendations after we receive feedback and have that conversation on the call. So depending on the content that we're going over, it may be, there may be more live polling or there may be more conversation. And the kind of work that comes out of those, the kind of outputs that come out of each of those meetings will also obviously depend on the content which we're going over. So for the implementation working group, we've created a new page on Colorado's Water Plan website, along with a new page where the Swazi documentation is going to live over the coming next 6-7 months. So this working group webpage you can access right in that implementation dropdown, but we'll be posting any sort of output or the PowerPoint slides we use, as well as a recording of each of the webinars, so that roundtables, if interested, can go back and review the conversations that were had and what was discussed. Any sort of output that we have that might be like second draft documents will also live here as well. This is a good point to remind you that the roundtables or you're serving as a representative to the roundtable, and the working group members should really be empowered in that role. That said, we're not interpreting any of these live poll voting points as a vote of the roundtable. This is really just the first and beginning of this feedback process, and it's our intention that this is creating a completely transparent process as we're figuring out these guidance documents and interpretation of Swazi along the way. And rather than creating documents that your roundtables could respond to in July, we're starting you in the beginning of this process to get your feedback as we go. So the working group will be our primary forum to discuss a lot of this guidance and feedback, but we encourage representatives, whoever can make it to those meetings among the 3 or 4 of you from each roundtable, to keep your roundtables updated through your regular meeting schedules. I think everyone knows that not every roundtable meets every month, and this working group has formed out of the need to make some decisions and move faster than we can with a general roundtable schedule, knowing that not every roundtable is able to hear an update every single month. You're always feel welcome to contact staff in between these meetings. Trying to think what else we got here. Didn't touch on that IPP list, but I am going to bring up the working group, or I mean the MEMS group. So we'll be reviewing. Sure. Okay. So we're excited. We're bringing on some master students that will be working with us throughout 2019 that are going to help review all of those Basin implementation plans, so that we can start some guidance off with a baseline understanding of where each plan was at in level of detail and content. They're going to really help us get to some common ground so that our recommendations can, for the next round of updates for those plans, can really start everyone off with a common place of, this is what we included in our last plan. These are some things that we're missing to get plans more comparable, so that we can do a little more apples to apples update for the next round, rather than making your roundtables do that full legwork themselves of looking backwards before you step forward. So that's an exciting thing that's happening, and they'll be starting in January with us.
Sorry, this is Greg again. I want to add one more thing too, that I think will be on the agenda for the January meeting, is a bit of a retrospective for you all. So being able to come to that meeting, with these hard questions about not only this Basin plan process and, why are we doing this and what's the point, but with kind of thinking back from your perspective, what really worked well last time and what maybe didn't. And of what of other Basin roundtables, kind of how yours compares, how your Basin plan compares, and maybe even the water plan itself, but just that general feedback, successes and failures, and areas for improvement, I guess. So we want to have that conversation and kind of start off there with, okay, we've been through this once. Everyone did a really good job, especially given the timeline, the deadlines that we had last time around. But it was a fairly open-ended process, and we got a lot of variability across the basins. So really just having that conversation about what people liked, what they didn't like, and where we go from here.
Hand it off to us.
So just to kind of build on what Megan and Greg have talked through, just a little bit on goals and kind of maybe slightly more specifics of where we want to go. So we're really trying to increase transparency. That sometimes we've gotten the comment that Swazi can feel like a black box, and really I think a lot of it's chalked up to just the process and how long it takes to kind of get going. We're doing modeling now, but we've been working, whether it's through the technical advisory groups or procurement process, or just kind of making some decisions behind the scenes of how things go since 2015, just to get to that step. So sometimes it's slow, but we realize that through that process, we could also kind of increase transparency, and we're seeing this as a way to not only do that, but to really help this be more of a Basin-led process. And to me, that breaks out into kind of three areas of getting Basin buy-in, Basin direction, and Basin review. So some examples would be for Basin buy-in, and I think that this starts to get to a little bit of the question that came in, and I'll build on it some more here in a second. But when we look at the BIP updates, I think the question that came in around what aspects need updating is on point. Certainly a focus is the IPPs. This is a very, and I realize that it's small, but this is just a subset. On the left, you're seeing of criteria that could go into updating IPPs. It's what we have seen as kind of maybe the more common elements that would be helpful in, for example, geolocating a project on a map, or even having a name for a project. Sometimes we don't even have the titles, having, showing that there's financial support or a backer for a given project. And as you can see, it's a bit of Swiss cheese across the different basins that we don't have that common information. So when we talk about metrics, or we're looking at information coming out of Swazi and looking where are the hotspots that might need attention, having better information that's going into IPPs and then specifically into a central database will allow everyone to kind of more easily access their own information and kind of pull some higher level metrics out of that. So this is an example of where we're hoping to come to some common understanding through this working group to better support and flesh out any issues that there might be, but kind of lay out some of these things that we're seeing that seem to make sense, and then get some feedback on, do we have it right, or what might be we not thinking about or missing, and trying to get a little bit more basin information in that area. So another example might be in terms of basin direction. The first time that we did the BIP updates, there was a guidance document, or the BIPs themselves, there was a guidance document that was issued that CWCB put out. This time around, thinking about how we can better utilize this group. So again, that question, what aspects of the BIP are we talking about? Well, this document outlined very specifics around how each chapter should be laid out, and we've seen the basins run with that to the extent that they want to, and they don't necessarily all have to look the same. I don't think that that's a very high level goal as much as it is to get the meaningful information out. And what we've heard from basins too about integrating SWASI. So there may be some tables in the BIPs that need updating with new SWASI information. Certainly the IPPs. I think a big core project of this, focus of this working group, really be to drill into that question and help you guys tell us what are those core elements. So I'm trying to make this less of a top-down approach and really tinge that with a little bit of reality of what makes the most sense, what would be the most helpful, and what are the kind of easiest points for updating that don't create a plethora of work that isn't really helpful. We certainly don't want to do things that aren't helpful. So this kind of getting better basin direction is a big piece of that. And then I would say, that kind of ties in with this, going back to the slide that Greg showed of the Chapter 11, these goals, whether that's really establishing the overall timeline of how often we should update things or helping inform that conversation, or if it's even just in this BIP update process, what is the time span that should be done on? Is it realistic to think we could have those updated by 2020? Or are we looking more at 2021? What would work for roundtables? And a big piece of that is, well, what's the volume of work we're talking about? So again, we are hoping through the course of these calls to kind of start to narrow in that focus on those questions and really get somewhere. And the master students that Megan mentioned, it's certainly not for them to take a path and say, here's what you need to do. It's more about to take that first cut, to have a work product that we could show that says, hey, we got some fresh eyes on the BIP. It looks like if I were only going to update a handful of things, maybe the background and history doesn't need updating, but table X, Y, and Z probably could be integrated with new SWASI information, and the IPPs or these other sections may also be areas that we want to consider updating. Then we would take that back to this team and really get their thoughts and the working group thoughts on how we should go about that. And if did we get it right? Are there things that we missed? Is it too much? Does it seem realistic? Those are the kind of questions we're hoping to drill into. And then last piece, basin review. We recognize that as we're, in the process of doing the modeling now in SWASI, and then as we move into 2019, we'll be more and more writing, not just the technical memorandums, but the document itself, that ultimately we're going to end up at a final chapter that includes some kind of higher level insights, recommendations, next steps. We think that those, we have an idea, maybe this concept of the IPPs and what should be updated, for example, might be a potential recommendation or insight. Maybe some of the things I mentioned around House Bill 1051 and the information kind of coming in wrong at times and needing to be fixed would be an example. But again, are we hitting everything? Are we saying things? Are we on point with the message there? We would really like to get basin feedback on helping set that direction, because we see that final recommendation chapter as really being informative to the BIP updates themselves. And so our thought is that, through this process, we'd actually get to a draft chapter that this working group could kind of help review and at least give a gut check on, did we get it mostly right? Is there some suggestion that everybody agrees should really be included that we didn't hit on? Or, is there something that we hit on that is not agreeable to the roundtable? So those are kind of three bigger level areas that we see in terms of really building this transparency and basin support. And then, of course, all of this will be wrapped up and kind of take some of the lessons learned from this group and the specific direction outside of the SWASI document itself, which, again, we hope to release in July of 2019, but really gearing up towards this Basin Roundtable Summit that we've now got planned for September 25th and 26th in Winter Park at the Headwater Center. It's a great location. It's very mission aligned with water and seems like a great venue since we haven't done a roundtable summit statewide for several years, it seems like it's a good opportunity. It's something that we've heard as we've gone around to roundtables that would be helpful. And I think it really builds on this point too. What should be included in VIP updates and having roundtables talk to roundtables and get some consensus. But the idea is that we would take some of the outputs from this working group and really use that as a more formal kickoff to the VIP update process and present some of the kind of general direction that we heard from this group and kind of float that by a larger team. So again, nothing on this working group is set in stone per se. It's all about kind of getting a gut check. Hoping to really increasingly bring more people into the tent as we kind of broaden the message. It's just to use this as a bit of a focus group to help us kind of level set on where to take things. And so we're pretty excited about that. So from there, it's really about just next steps and kicking off these meetings. And we're really excited. Again, appreciate your time today and being on the phone, and look forward to any other questions you have. And with that, I think we could take some questions unless there's something else.
Yeah, so feel free to unmute yourself, ask questions. You can certainly use the chat function as well moving forward. One other thing I wanted to mention to Melinda's question about kind of the timing of the ask and kind of the timing of the planning cycle. I really wanted to reiterate that this potential ask that we have in the projects bill, and again, we'll see where things go with legislature, but that 5.5 million, the vision there is that this is really for water planning kind of writ large. So not just obviously the water plan proper, but basin plan, as I mentioned, and how all of that feeds into even the next iteration of the statewide water supply initiative update. So big picture, and everything that we're doing is really trying to figure out the evolution of this planning process over the last 15 years. I think it's, you could really make the argument that Swazi in 2004 and then in 2010 really was our water plan at the time, and then things have evolved with a new water plan that came out in 2015 that was really more policy focused, of course, building on all that other work and all the basin plans. And now we're doing everything we can to put a lot of thought into this, and that includes figuring out what the funding might look like to keep this going in the many years ahead. So more than anything, the thing to keep in mind is that this is not something we're going to do in 2019. That funding specifically, that 5.5 million, is really for the next 3 to 4 years. And then that will really help us, as Russ had mentioned, to really streamline this process so that it's not such a heavy lift. So we have the structure, if you will, things like the online infrastructure, the database and whatnot, to really make this as smooth as possible. So we've even been looking to, other states like Texas that have to some extent, a similar process. And in some ways, they have a more highly evolved process of really tracking their projects and having things kind of split out between the basins and how they support that with different contracts. So really being open to, models that work and trying to be as forward thinking as we can. And going to the legislature when it's appropriate, when the funding is there. We do have some funding available this year, which is the other piece of that. As you all probably well know, our funding is very up and down, depending, especially on severance tax, but other things as well. And so you never know where things are going to be, 2, 3, 4 years from now. But being able to hopefully be prepared and not have to be in a situation where we might have an ask from the executive branch that says you need to update something by such and such deadline, and not have the resources available to do that, and then have to cannibalize grant programs or something like that. We're really trying to get out in front of that and really figure out what makes the most sense.
Is there a question on the phone?
Sounds like someone was.
Brought to you by mesobook.com.
Okay. We only got 8 minutes.
Okay. We're fine with no.
Comes up. And again, just to reiterate that certainly appreciate all the interest and really excited and appreciate the time commitment from the folks that are going to be on this working group over the next several months. But those who aren't, certainly the intent is to keep you involved in the process and have updates go into that central website where we'll have a page that, any kind of documents that might come out of this will be posted there. So there'll be ways to keep tabs. And then, of course, working with the working group itself to kind of go and report back to the roundtables as well.
And we are certainly open to questions any step of the way. So feel free to reach out. Yeah, you all know where to find us. Any staff members with questions or comments that you have moving forward.
Greg, this is Doug Kemper. I had everybody muted, and so when we tried unmuting, that's when we had the audio feedback issue. It's probably best to use the chat box if there are any further questions.
Got it. Thanks so much, Doug.
That kicked off.
Doug has very graciously been helping us with the technology today, so thanks again. And my apologies for any hiccups. We can stay on a couple more minutes if there's questions. We've got the whole 90 minutes, but of course, as I said, we certainly did not want to use everyone's time. We didn't need to. Looks like we've got a question coming in.
Yes.
Yes. Will there be a list of the group members in case folks want to provide feedback, direction? Yes, we will create a list on the website similar to a list of the tags for Swazi that will be on that webpage, which I referred to on the water plan site.
Yeah, so absolutely, we will have a list. Megan's been doing a great job. We have a little more latitude in how we can edit that water plan website, so we've been using that. And as I mentioned briefly, we're trying to overhaul our very old website. It's been about 10 years, so we're doing our best there, but stay tuned on that end. So for now, check the water plan website. And it's specifically, it's a tab, it's an implementation tab, is that right?
Yeah, it's the first drop down on the implementation tab.
Great. All right, well, I think we're set unless anybody has any other questions today. Otherwise, feel free to call, email, come down to 1313 Sherman. We're always happy to chat. Thanks so much for everyone's time. Really appreciate it. We'll be reaching out with more details for the January meeting.
Thanks all. And happy holidays.
Yeah.